23 years ago, a soldier lost everything in one explosion: his face, his wife, and his little girl. Today at 65 he sits alone in a park feeding pigeons, but a stranger is about to approach him with impossible news about his daughter. That stranger? Jesus himself. The autumn leaves danced around Michael Thompson's weathered combat boots as he sat on the same park bench he'd occupied every Tuesday for the past 3 years. At 65 his body carried the weight of decades, not just in years but in scars that told stories most people couldn't bear to hear. The right side of his face bore the permanent reminder of an IED explosion in Fallujah 23 years ago. The burns had healed, but they'd left behind a roadmap of raised tissue that children stared at and adults quickly looked away from. Michael pulled his worn baseball cap lower over his eyes and reached into the paper bag beside him. The pigeons knew his routine better than most humans did. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m. he'd arrive with day-old bread from Morrison's bakery. The owner, Mrs. Chen, always saved the unsold loaves for him. It wasn't charity, she insisted. It was appreciation for his service. Michael never corrected her assumption that he was grateful for recognition. The truth was, he came here because the pigeons didn't care about his face, didn't ask questions about his service, and never looked at him with pity. "Here you go, guys," he murmured, tossing pieces of wheat bread onto the concrete. The familiar flock gathered around his feet. There was old Pete with his missing toe, Rosie with her distinctive red-tinged feathers, and newcomer Slim, who always hung back until the others had eaten their fill. Michael had names for all 16 regular visitors. They were the closest thing to family he had these days. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd survived 3 tours of duty, countless firefights, and an explosion that should have killed him, only to end up befriending birds in a city park. But here he was, 65 years old, living on disability checks and militaries in a studio apartment 12 blocks away. The place was clean, organized with military precision, but empty of everything that made a house a home. No family photos on the walls, he'd thrown those away years ago. No wedding ring on his finger, he'd sold that to pay rent during a particularly rough patch in '09. No contact with extended family, they'd all chosen sides when Sarah left, and they hadn't chosen his. Michael's mind wandered, as it often did during these quiet moments, back to the last time he'd held his daughter Emma. She'd been 3 years old, with blonde pigtails and Sarah's bright blue eyes. The morning he'd left for Iraq, Emma had clung to his leg, not understanding why Daddy had to go away. He'd promised her he'd bring back presents and stories. He'd promised Sarah he'd come back safe. He'd kept one of those promises. The memories came in fragments, the way trauma often does. Sarah's perfume when he'd kissed her goodbye at the inn. Emma's tiny hand waving from the terminal window. The weight of his gear as he'd boarded the transport plane. The heat of the Iraqi desert. The explosion that changed everything. The months in the burn unit in Germany. The letters from Sarah that grew shorter and less frequent. The final letter that ended with, "I can't do this anymore, Michael. I'm sorry." By the time he'd healed enough to travel back to Fort Campbell, Sarah was gone. The house was empty except for a note on the kitchen table and divorce papers served by her attorney. She'd taken Emma to California to live with a man named David Harrison, a software engineer she'd met at her sister's wedding while Michael was overseas. The note was brief. "Emma needs stability and a father who can be present. David wants to adopt her. It's better this way." Michael had fought it, of course. He'd hired a lawyer he couldn't afford, and spent 3 years battling a system that seemed designed to work against him. But Sarah had documentation of his PTSD episodes, photos of his injuries, testimony about his inability to provide a stable environment. David Harrison had money, connections, and a face that didn't frighten children. The judge's decision was swift. David could adopt Emma, and her last name would be changed from Thompson to Harrison. The final blow came when the court ruled that contact would be detrimental to the child's adjustment. No visitation, no phone calls, no birthday cards. Emma Thompson legally ceased to exist, replaced by Emma Harrison, a girl who would grow up believing David was her biological father, and Michael was just a stranger who'd once been married to her mother. "Excuse me, sir." Michael looked up from his reverie to see a man approaching the bench. He was tall, probably in his 30s, with shoulder-length dark hair and a beard. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a white t-shirt, and a red flannel shirt that seemed too light for the October weather. What struck Michael immediately were the man's eyes. They were dark brown, almost black, but they held a depth that seemed to go on forever. More unsettling was the way the man looked at him. Not with the usual mixture of curiosity and discomfort people showed when they saw his scars, but with something Michael couldn't quite identify. Recognition, compassion, understanding. "Yes?" Michael's voice came out gruffer than he'd intended. Years of isolation had made him wary of strangers who approached him voluntarily. "Mind if I sit? All the other benches seem to be taken." The man gestured around the park, and Michael noticed for the first time that the area was unusually crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. Families with children, elderly couples, joggers taking water breaks, every other bench was indeed occupied. Michael shrugged, and moved his paper bag to make room. The man sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the pigeons feast on the scattered breadcrumbs. "You know," the stranger said eventually, "I've always found it interesting how people underestimate pigeons. Most folks see them as pests, but they're actually remarkably intelligent. Loyal too. They mate for life, most of them." Michael glanced at him sideways. "You seem to know a lot about birds." The man smiled. "I know a lot about many things. Take you for example." He turned to face Michael directly. "You come here every Tuesday at 2 p.m. You buy day-old bread from Mrs. Chen's bakery. She charges you half price but tells you it's a military discount. You've named all the pigeons. You live alone in apartment 4B at the Riverside complex. You haven't spoken to your daughter in 23 years. Michael's blood ran cold. He started to stand, his hand instinctively moving to his hip, where he'd once carried a sidearm. "Who the hell are you? How do you know?" "Sit down, Michael." The man's voice was gentle but carried an authority that Michael found himself obeying despite his alarm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because someone who loves you very much asked me to come." "Nobody loves me, pal. Trust me on that." Michael's voice was bitter. "My wife left me for another man. My daughter doesn't even know I exist. My parents are dead, and my brother hasn't spoken to me since Sarah took the house in the divorce settlement." "You're wrong about Emma." The name hit Michael like a physical blow. He hadn't heard anyone speak his daughter's name in years. "How do you know that name? Who told you about?" "She remembers you, Michael. She's always remembered you." Michael's hands began to shake. He gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. "That's impossible. She was 3. The adoption papers, the name change. Sarah made sure she'd forget. David Harrison became her father. She probably doesn't even know I exist." The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was slightly worn, as if it had been handled many times. He held it out to Michael. "Does this look like someone who forgot her father?" With trembling fingers Michael took the photograph. The image showed a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, standing in what looked like a living room. She had blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and Sarah's blue eyes, but her smile, that was all Michael. What made his breath catch, however, was what she was holding. It was a small battered teddy bear, wearing a miniature army uniform. Michael recognized it immediately. "Mr. Patches," he whispered. "She's kept him all these years," the stranger said softly. "She told David when she was 7, that Mr. Patches was from her first daddy, and that she would never ever throw him away. When David tried to replace him with a new bear, she hid Mr. Patches under her mattress. She's 26 now, Michael. She's a nurse at Children's Hospital in Sacramento. She volunteers at a veterans support group on weekends, and she's been looking for you." Michael's vision blurred as tears he hadn't allowed himself to cry in decades filled his eyes. "Looking for me? Why would she? I mean, Sarah told her I was dead, didn't she? That's what they usually do. Sarah told her you were a soldier who went away and couldn't come back. Emma figured out the truth when she was 16, and found her original birth certificate in Sarah's filing cabinet. She saw your name listed as her father. She's been searching for Michael Thompson ever since." The photograph shook in Michael's hands. His daughter, his little girl, who used to make him tea parties with stuffed animals, and insisted he use his fancy voice when he played the prince in her made-up stories. She was alive, grown up, and she remembered him. "This could be anyone," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You could be some kind of con artist, or she has a scar on her left knee from when she fell off her tricycle in the driveway of your old house on Maple Street. She was wearing her favorite purple dress, the one with the unicorns, that you bought her for her 3rd birthday. You carried her inside, cleaned the cut, and put a band-aid with cartoon characters on it. She cried not because it hurt, but because she thought she'd ruined her special dress." Michael's breath caught. He'd never told anyone about that day. It had happened 2 weeks before he deployed. Sarah had been at work, and he'd been watching Emma alone. "You sang to her," the stranger continued. "An old song your father used to sing to you. 'You are my sunshine.' She still hums it when she's nervous." Michael was crying now, silent tears streaming down both sides of his face, following the pattern of his scars. "How could you possibly know that?" The stranger's eyes held infinite compassion. "Because I know everything about you, Michael. I know about the night in Fallujah when you shielded Private Rodriguez from the blast that left those marks on your face. I know about the 3 families you helped evacuate before the building collapsed. I know about the medals they gave you, and the nightmares they couldn't take away. I know about the nights you've stood on your apartment balcony, wondering if anyone would miss you if you jumped. Michael's sob was audible now. Who are you? I'm someone who understands what it means to be separated from those you love. I'm someone who knows the pain of sacrifice, of giving everything for others and feeling forgotten. I'm someone who specializes in impossible reunions. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, trying to regain some composure. Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, Emma has a life now, a father who raised her, a family that's been there. Why would she want to complicate that by finding me?
Because David Harrison died in a car accident 3 years ago. The words hit Michael like another IED blast. Emma was devastated, the stranger continued. David was a good man who loved her like his own, but his death awakened something in her, a need to connect with her biological father. She hired a private investigator last year. Do you know what happened to him? Michael shook his head, afraid to speak. He found you, 3 months ago. He took photos of you feeding the pigeons, documented your address, your routine. He was going to contact you, but Emma asked him to wait. She was scared, Michael. Scared you wouldn't want to see her. Scared you'd think she was betraying David's memory. Scared you'd look at her and only see the wife who left you. Michael stared at the photograph again. His daughter, 26 years old, grown and beautiful and accomplished. A nurse. Someone who helped people heal. Someone who volunteered to help veterans like him. She wants to see me. She's been hoping for it every day for the past 3 years. But she's also terrified. She doesn't know about your injuries, Michael. The investigator's report only mentioned that you were a decorated veteran living on disability. She doesn't know if you're angry at her for not finding you sooner. She doesn't know if you blame her for Sarah leaving. She doesn't know if you can ever forgive her for growing up calling another man dad. Michael's heart was breaking and healing simultaneously. All these years he'd imagined Emma growing up happy and loved, occasionally wondering if she ever thought about him. The idea that she'd been searching for him, that she'd kept Mr. Patches, that she remembered their time together, it was more than he'd ever dared to hope for. I could never blame her, he whispered. She was just a baby. None of it was her fault. She needs to hear that from you. Michael looked up at the stranger. There was something about him that defied logic. His presence was calming in a way that reminded Michael of the military chaplains who'd visited him in the hospital. But this was different. This man radiated a peace that seemed to touch something deep in Michael's soul, a place that had been dark for 23 years. Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this? The man smiled, and for a moment Michael could have sworn there was light radiating from his face. I get the joy of watching a father and daughter love each other again. I get the satisfaction of knowing that a man who sacrificed everything for his country gets to experience grace he never thought possible. I get to witness a miracle, Michael. And miracles are my specialty. The pigeons had finished their feast and were beginning to disperse. Old Pete lingered near Michael's feet, cocking his head as if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation. Michael reached down absently and stroked the bird's gray feathers. What would I even say to her? I'm not the man she remembered. I'm broken, scarred. I live in a studio apartment and my only friends are pigeons. She's a successful nurse with her whole life ahead of her. What could I possibly offer her? Yourself, the stranger said simply. That's all any parent can offer their child, their authentic self, with all the scars and imperfections and love that comes with it. Emma doesn't need you to be perfect, Michael. She needs you to be her father. Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd heard. A part of him wanted to dismiss this entire conversation as an elaborate fantasy, but the photograph in his hands was real. The details about Emma's childhood were too specific to be coincidence. And something deep in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive in 3 combat zones, told him this stranger was telling the truth. If I wanted to see her, Michael said carefully, hypothetically speaking, how would that work? I mean, she's in California. I don't have money for plane tickets, and even if I did, what if she takes one look at me and changes her mind? The stranger reached into his other pocket and pulled out an envelope. Emma is flying here this weekend. She's staying at the Marriott downtown. Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m., she'll be at Riverside Park, the one 6 blocks north of here. She'll be sitting on the bench by the duck pond, wearing a red coat and carrying a brown leather purse. She'll have Mr. Patches with her. Michael stared at the envelope. What's in there? Information. Her phone number in case you want to call first. a photo of her at her graduation from nursing school, a letter she wrote to you but never sent, and a check to cover any expenses you might have for clothes or transportation. I can't take money from a stranger. You're not. The check is from Emma. She's been saving money for 2 years, hoping for this day. Michael's hands shook as he took the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with 23 years of separation and hope. There's one more thing, the stranger said. Emma has a daughter. Michael's head snapped up. What? She's 4 years old. Her name is Grace. Emma named her after the Grace she hoped to find with her father someday. The man's smile was gentle. Congratulations, Michael. You're a grandfather. The revelation hit Michael like a third explosion, this one made of pure joy mixed with overwhelming grief for all the time he'd lost. A granddaughter. 4 years old, the same age Emma had been when he'd lost her. Does Grace know about me? Emma tells her stories about the brave soldier grandfather who went away but might come home someday. Grace has been asking when she gets to meet Grandpa Mike. Michael couldn't speak. The emotions were too big, too overwhelming. 23 years of grief and loneliness were crashing against a tidal wave of hope and possibility. The stranger stood up from the bench. I should go now. You have a lot to think about. Wait. Michael called out, I still don't know your name. The man turned back and his smile contained all the warmth Michael had been missing for over 2 decades. My name is Jesus, Michael, and I've been waiting a long time to answer your prayers. Before Michael could respond, before he could ask what that meant or how it was possible, the man walked away. Michael watched him go, noting how other people in the park seemed to turn and look as he passed, their faces lighting up with inexplicable smiles. When Jesus reached the far edge of the park, he simply disappeared. Not behind a tree or around a building. He just wasn't there anymore. Michael sat alone on the bench, clutching the envelope and the photograph, wondering if he'd just experienced a psychotic break or a miracle. The pigeons had all flown away except for old Pete, who remained at his feet, looking up at him, with what seemed like understanding. What do you think, Pete? Michael whispered. Was that real? The pigeon cocked his head and made a soft cooing sound that almost sounded like encouragement. Michael opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was everything Jesus had promised plus something else, a small card with an address and time. Saturday 3 p.m., Riverside Park. Written on the bottom in handwriting he somehow knew was Emma's. I'll wait as long as it takes, Dad. Love, Emma and Grace. Michael Thompson, 65-year-old veteran, with a scarred face and a broken heart, sat on a park bench and cried tears of joy for the first time in 23 years. The envelope sat on Michael's kitchen table for 3 days, unopened except for that first miraculous moment in the park. He'd circle around it like it was an unexploded ordnance, approaching cautiously before retreating to the safety of his familiar routines. Wednesday morning coffee. Wednesday afternoon walk to the grocery store. Wednesday evening news and microwave dinner. But the envelope remained there, a tangible reminder that his entire world had shifted on a Tuesday afternoon. Michael's studio apartment at the Riverside complex wasn't much to look at. 450 square feet of practical living space decorated in what his therapist years ago had called military minimalism. Everything had its place. Boots lined up by the door, shirts hung at precise intervals in the closet, canned goods arranged alphabetically in the small kitchenette. The only deviation from perfect order was the growing collection of pigeon feathers he'd saved over the years, pressed between the pages of an old Bible his mother had given him before his first deployment. Thursday morning brought an unusual disruption to his routine. Mrs. Chen from the bakery knocked on his door at 8 a.m., holding a paper bag that smelled like fresh cinnamon rolls. Mr. Thompson, she said in her accented English, I made too many this morning, would you like some? It was a lie, and they both knew it. Mrs. Chen never made too much of anything. She ran her bakery with the efficiency of a military quartermaster, but Michael had learned to accept these small kindnesses without protest. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. They smell wonderful. She peered past him at the envelope on the table. Good news, I hope. Michael followed her gaze. I'm not sure yet. Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. She was 73, had survived the Vietnam War as a child refugee, and understood that some news required time to digest. In my country we have saying, the heart knows truth before mind accepts it. Maybe your heart already knows about this letter. After she left, Michael sat with the warm cinnamon roll and black coffee staring at the envelope. His heart. What did his heart know? For 23 years he'd trained it not to hope, not to dream, not to imagine scenarios where Emma might come looking for him. Hope was dangerous for men like him, men who'd lost everything and learned to live with nothing. but since Tuesday something had shifted. The stranger, Jesus, he'd called himself, had awakened something Michael thought was permanently dead. Not just hope, but faith. Faith that maybe, just maybe, the worst parts of his story weren't the ending. Friday afternoon, he finally opened the envelope completely. The letter from Emma was handwritten on cream-colored stationery. Her handwriting was neat, careful, the penmanship of someone who'd grown up writing thank you notes and school reports by hand. Dear Dad, I don't know if I have the right to call you that. David Harrison was the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. But you're the one who gave me life, who sang to me when I was scared, who bought me Mr. Patches and told me stories about brave knights and beautiful princesses. I found your name on my birth certificate when I was 16. Mom tried to explain, but I could see in her eyes that there was more to the story than she was telling me. She said you were a soldier who went away and couldn't come back. For years I believed that meant you were dead. It wasn't until I was in college that I realized she might have meant something else entirely. David died 3 years ago, sudden heart attack. He was only 58. At his funeral, when people were sharing memories about what a wonderful father he'd been, I felt guilty because all I could think about was you. About whether you were alive somewhere, whether you ever wondered about me, whether you'd want to know that I became a nurse like I always said I would when I was little. I hired a private investigator last year. When he found you, I was terrified. What if you were angry that I'd had another father? What if you thought I'd forgotten you? What if you looked at me and only saw the woman who broke your heart? But then I had Grace, and everything changed. The moment I held her, I understood what you must have felt when you held me. The love was so fierce, so immediate, so protective. I realized that a parent's love doesn't diminish with time or distance. It just waits. I kept Mr. Patches all these years. When David would ask about him, I'd say he was from my first daddy, and that first daddies never really go away. They just love you from far away until you can find each other again. If you're reading this, it means you want to find each other again too. I'll be at Riverside Park on Saturday at 3 p.m. I'll wait as long as you need me to. If you're not ready, I understand, but if you are, I have 23 years of stories to share, and a granddaughter who wants to meet the brave soldier in all my bedtime stories. With all my love and hope, Emma. P.S. I still remember you are my sunshine. I sing it to Grace every night. Michael read the letter 4 times before the words stopped blurring through his tears. His daughter, his brilliant, compassionate, beautiful daughter, had become exactly the kind of person he'd hoped she would when he used to rock her to sleep with promises about all the adventures they'd have together. The photograph from her nursing school graduation showed Emma in her white coat, diploma in hand, beaming with pride. Behind her stood an older man with kind eyes and graying hair. David Harrison, Michael realized. The man who'd raised his daughter, who'd been there for all the moments Michael had missed. Instead of the jealousy he'd expected to feel, Michael found himself grateful. David had clearly loved Emma, had given her stability and opportunities and the kind of father she'd deserved to have. The last item in the envelope was a smaller photograph that made Michael's breath catch. Emma was kneeling next to a little girl with blonde curls and bright blue eyes. The child was wearing a tiny hospital gown and clutching a stuffed animal, not Mr. Patches, but a small white lamb. They were both smiling despite the clinical setting. On the back, Emma had written, Grace, during her appendectomy last year. She insisted on bringing Lambie for courage. She's just like you, brave even when she's scared. A granddaughter, 4 years old. Michael tried to imagine what she'd be like. Would she have Emma's serious concentration when she was thinking? Would she like stories about knights and dragons? Would she be afraid of his scars, or would she accept them with the uncomplicated honesty of children? Friday evening, Michael did something he hadn't done in years. He went shopping for new clothes. The department store felt like foreign territory. Bright lights, crowds of people, choices he wasn't equipped to make. A young sales associate with a genuine smile approached him near the men's section. Can I help you find anything specific? Michael touched his scarred cheek self-consciously. I'm meeting my daughter for the first time in 23 years. Tomorrow, I want to look. He struggled for the right word. Respectable. The young man's expression shifted to something warmer. First time in 23 years.
That's incredible.
What size are you? For the next hour, the associate, Tyler, his name tag read, helped Michael select a navy blue button-down shirt, khaki pants, and a brown leather jacket that covered most of his arm scars, while still allowing movement. Tyler even suggested a trim at the salon next door. The barber there is ex-military, Tyler said. Tell him Marcus sent you. He'll take good care of you. The barber Joe was indeed ex-military, Army Rangers, 2 tours in Afghanistan. He took one look at Michael's face and nodded with understanding. Big day tomorrow, he asked as he worked. Meeting my daughter for the first time since she was 3. Joe's hands stilled for a moment. Deployment. Iraq. Her mother left while I was in the burn unit in Germany. Joe resumed cutting with practiced efficiency. My ex took my son to Oregon while I was in Kandahar. Haven't seen him in 6 years. Different circumstances, same pain. They finished the haircut in comfortable silence, the kind that exists between men who've carried similar burdens. When Joe handed him the mirror, Michael barely recognized himself. The careful trimming and styling had softened his scars somehow, making them part of his face rather than the defining feature. No charge, Joe said when Michael reached for his wallet. I can pay. One soldier to another. Go get your daughter back. Friday night, Michael lay awake staring at the ceiling. In 12 hours, he would see Emma again. In 12 hours, he would meet his granddaughter. In 12 hours, his carefully constructed life of isolation and routine would either expand into something he'd never dared to dream, or shatter completely, if Emma took one look at him and realized she'd made a mistake. He thought about the stranger who'd called himself Jesus. In the 3 days since their meeting, Michael had almost convinced himself it had been a hallucination, a stress-induced fantasy born from too many years of loneliness. But the envelope was real, the photographs were real, the letter was real, and there had been something about the man's presence that defied rational explanation, a peace that had touched the deepest parts of Michael's wounded soul. A knowledge that went beyond what any private investigator could have uncovered. A love that felt divine. Michael had been raised in the church, back when his mother was alive, and his family attended Sunday services at First Baptist. He'd prayed during firefights in Iraq, bargained with God during the worst of his recovery, and eventually stopped talking to the Almighty altogether when it became clear that his prayers for his family weren't going to be answered. But Tuesday afternoon, sitting on that park bench, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The presence of something larger than himself, something that cared about his story, something that was actively working to write a better ending than the one he'd resigned himself to. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. Michael was awake at 5 a.m. too nervous to sleep. He made coffee, showered, dressed in his new clothes, and spent 20 minutes practicing what he might say to Emma. Every opening line sounded inadequate. How do you summarize 23 years of loss, regret and love into words that won't overwhelm a reunion that's already fragile? At noon, he walked to Riverside Park, not the one where he fed pigeons, but the larger one 6 blocks north, with the duck pond and playground. He wanted to see the location, to familiarize himself with the terrain the way he would before any important mission. The park was busy with Saturday afternoon families. Children played on swings while parents watched from benches. Couples walked hand in hand around the pond. Dogs chased tennis balls across the open grass. It was the kind of scene Michael usually avoided. Too much happiness, too many reminders of the life he'd lost. But today, it felt different. Today, he belonged here. The bench by the duck pond was positioned perfectly, visible from multiple angles, but private enough for conversation. Michael sat down briefly, testing the view, imagining Emma approaching from the parking lot or the walking path. Would he recognize her instantly? Would she recognize him despite the changes time and injury had made?
At 2:30, Michael returned to the bench with 10 minutes to spare. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it over the sound of children playing nearby. In his jacket pocket he carried a small gift, a wooden bracelet he'd carved during his early days of physical therapy. It was simple, unvarnished, carved with small flowers around the band. He'd made it for Emma when she was 3, intending to give it to her when he returned from Iraq. He'd kept it all these years, unable to throw away the symbol of his hopes for their future. At 2:58, he saw her. A woman in a red coat was walking slowly around the pond, scanning the benches. She had blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and even from a distance, Michael could see the blue eyes that were exactly like Sarah's. She was holding the hand of a small girl with blonde curls, who was skipping beside her, chattering excitedly about the ducks. Emma spotted him at the same moment he saw her. She stopped walking, her free hand rising to her mouth. Even across the distance, Michael could see her recognize him. Not from recent memory, but from some deeper place, where 23 years collapsed into nothing. The little girl, Grace, noticed her mother had stopped and looked in Michael's direction.
She said something to Emma, tugged on her hand, pointed toward the bench. Emma nodded, wiped her eyes, and began walking toward him again. Michael stood up slowly, his legs shaky with adrenaline and emotion. As they got closer, he could see that Emma was crying. Grace was looking at him with the frank curiosity of a 4-year-old, unafraid but assessingly. They stopped about 10 feet away from the bench. Emma was staring at his face, taking in the scars, the changes that 23 years and trauma had written across his features. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody spoke. Then Grace broke the silence. "Are you Grandpa Mike?" she asked in a clear, sweet voice. Michael's vision blurred. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm Grandpa Mike. Mommy said you're very brave. She said you helped save people in the war. Your mommy was right, but the bravest thing I ever did was love her." Emma's sob was audible now. She released Grace's hand and took a step forward, then another, then she was running toward him. Michael opened his arms and caught his daughter, 26 years old but feeling exactly like the 3-year-old he'd said goodbye to at the airport so many years ago. They held each other without speaking, 23 years of separation dissolving in a moment of pure connection. Michael could smell Emma's shampoo, feel her tears soaking through his new shirt, hear her whispered "Daddy" repeated over and over like a prayer. Grace watched this reunion with the patience of a child who'd been prepared for emotional adults. When Emma and Michael finally separated, she stepped forward and looked up at him seriously. "Mommy says you have always on your face from being a hero." Michael knelt down to her level, bringing his scarred face closer to her eye level. "Yes, I do. Do they scare you?" Grace studied him carefully, then reached out with one small finger and traced one of the larger scars on his cheek. "No. My teacher Mrs. Wilson has always on her arm from a car accident. She says always tell stories about times when we were very strong." Michael's heart swelled with love for this brave, wise little girl who was his granddaughter. "What's your always story, Grandpa Mike?" "There was a big boom and I got hurt saving my friend, but I lived and now I get to meet you, so I think it was worth it." Grace nodded approvingly. "Can I hug you?" Michael opened his arms and Grace stepped into them without hesitation. She hugged him with the fierce, uncomplicated love of a child, her small arms around his neck, her curls tickling his scarred cheek. "I brought you something," Grace announced, pulling back from the hug. She reached into her small backpack and produced a drawing, stick figures in crayon labeled Mommy, Grace and Grandpa Mike. The Grandpa Mike figure was wearing what appeared to be a military uniform and had a big smile. "I drew this for you. Mommy helped me spell the words." Michael accepted the drawing with hands that shook with emotion. "This is the most beautiful picture I've ever seen. Thank you, Grace." Emma had been watching this exchange with tears streaming down her face. When Michael stood up, she handed him something wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought you something too," she said softly. Michael unwrapped the tissue to find Mr. Patches, the little teddy bear in the miniature army uniform. The bear was worn from years of love, his fur faded and thin in places, but his little uniform was carefully maintained. "I've kept him with me through everything," Emma said. 3 moves, college, nursing school, my wedding, Grace's birth. He's been waiting to come home to you. Michael held the small bear, remembering the day he'd bought it at the PX before his deployment. He'd imagined giving it to Emma when he returned, imagined her squealing with delight over her soldier bear. Now 23 years later, Mr. Patches was finally coming home. "I have something for you too," Michael said, reaching into his pocket for the wooden bracelet. "I made this for you when you were 3. I was going to give it to you when I came back from Iraq." Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the simple wooden flowers carved around the band. "You made this during physical therapy." "I was learning to use my hands again, after the burns." The therapist said it was good for fine motor skills, but really I just wanted to make something beautiful for my little girl. Emma slipped the bracelet over her wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 23 years for this moment. "It's perfect, Dad. It's absolutely perfect." The word Dad hit Michael like a blessing. Not Father or Michael, or even Sir, but Dad, the title he'd lost when she was 3 and thought he'd never hear again. They spent the next 3 hours on that bench by the duck pond, filling in 23 years of separation with stories, photographs, and the careful construction of a relationship that had been interrupted but never broken. Emma told him about her childhood, with David, her decision to become a nurse, her late husband, who died of cancer when Grace was just a year old. "David was wonderful," she said. "He loved me completely, never made me feel like his stepdaughter." But he always knew there was a part of my heart that belonged to my first dad. He encouraged me to find you." Michael told her about his recovery, his struggles with PTSD, his quiet life feeding pigeons, and working part-time at a veterans center. He apologized for not fighting harder to find her, for letting the legal system convince him that she was better off without him. "I thought about you every day," he said. "I wondered if you were happy, if you were safe, if you ever remembered the songs I used to sing to you." "I remembered everything," Emma replied. "Maybe not clearly, but in my heart. David used to say I had an old soul, that I seemed to be missing something. I think I was missing you." Grace spent the afternoon moving between her mother's lap and Michael's, accepting him into her family with the adaptability of childhood. She showed him how to skip stones on the pond, shared her animal crackers, and asked if Grandpa Mike knew any good stories about knights and dragons. "Actually," Michael said, "I know a story about a brave little princess who had to wait a very long time for her knight to come home from war." "Tell me," Grace demanded, settling against his chest with the trust that only children possess. As Michael began the story, a thinly veiled allegory of their own situation, he felt a presence beside him. Not visible, but unmistakable, the same sense of peace and rightness he'd experienced on Tuesday with the stranger who'd called himself Jesus. Emma must have felt it too, because she looked around the park with a puzzled expression. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. "Feel what?" Michael asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "Like someone's watching over us, like this moment is blessed somehow." Michael smiled, thinking of the man with kind eyes who'd known impossible details about their lives. "I think it is, sweetheart. I think this moment has been waiting for us for a very long time." As the sun began to set over Riverside Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Michael Thompson sat surrounded by his family, his daughter and granddaughter, his teddy bear, and carved bracelet, 23 years of love that had never diminished despite the distance. For the first time since that explosion in Fallujah, Michael felt whole. 3 weeks had passed since that miraculous afternoon at Riverside Park, and Michael Thompson's life had transformed in ways he'd never dared to imagine. Emma and Grace had extended their stay indefinitely. Emma was able to transfer to a nursing position at Denver General, and Grace had started pre-K at the elementary school just 4 blocks from Michael's apartment complex. What had been a sterile bachelor's refuge was now filled with the chaos and joy of family life. Grace's drawings taped to the refrigerator, Emma's medical journals scattered across his kitchen table, and the sound of laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for over 2 decades. But it was Tuesday afternoon, and Michael had maintained one sacred routine, his weekly visit to feed the pigeons at Veterans Memorial Park. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Grace skipped beside him, her small hand tucked securely in his, chattering excitedly about the birdie friends they were going to visit. "Tell me about old Pete again, Grandpa Mike," she demanded as they approached the familiar bench. "Well," Michael said, settling onto the bench with Grace beside him, "old Pete is the leader of the flock. He's got one toe missing from his right foot, probably from a fight when he was younger. But he's brave and smart, and he always makes sure the other pigeons get to eat before he does." "Like you did in the army?" Michael's heart swelled. Emma had been telling Grace stories about his military service, focusing on the heroic aspects while age-appropriately explaining his injuries. To Grace, Grandpa Mike wasn't a broken veteran. He was a real-life superhero who'd gotten hurt saving people. "Something like that, sweetheart." As if summoned by their conversation, the familiar flock began to gather. Old Pete strutted forward with his distinctive limp, followed by Rosie and Slim and the rest of Michael's feathered congregation. Grace squealed with delight and immediately began distributing pieces of bread with the serious concentration of a 4-year-old performing an important task. "Grandpa Mike," she said after several minutes of focused feeding, "who's that man watching us?" Michael looked up to see a familiar figure approaching across the park, tall with shoulder-length dark hair and wearing the same simple clothes, jeans, white t-shirt, and red flannel shirt. Jesus was walking toward them with that same peaceful smile, and Michael's heart began to race with recognition and gratitude. "Grace, honey, stay right here with the pigeons for a minute. Grandpa needs to talk to that man." Michael stood and walked toward Jesus, meeting him halfway between the bench and the park's main path. Up close, Jesus looked exactly the same as he had 3 weeks ago, ageless, serene, with those impossibly deep brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "Hello, Michael," Jesus said softly. "I see things have changed for you." "Everything's changed," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Because of you. Because of what you did, what you told me. My daughter, my granddaughter. I have a family again." Jesus glanced toward the bench where Grace was having an animated conversation with old Pete, apparently explaining the proper etiquette of pigeon feeding. "She's beautiful, Emma did an excellent job raising her." "She did. And David Harrison, the man who raised Emma, he was a good father to her. I want you to know that I'm grateful to him, not bitter. He gave my daughter the stability and love she needed when I couldn't." Jesus nodded approvingly. "Forgiveness and gratitude are powerful forces, Michael. They heal wounds that bitterness keeps festering." Michael looked back at Grace, who had now enlisted old Pete as her assistant in arranging breadcrumbs in artistic patterns. "I never thought I'd be a grandfather. Never thought I'd get to read bedtime stories, or teach someone to skip stones or watch cartoons on Saturday morning. You gave me back 23 years of love that I thought was lost forever." "I didn't give you anything that wasn't already yours," Jesus replied. "I just helped you find what had been waiting for you all along." "But how? How did you know where to find Emma? How did you know about Mr. Patches and the songs and all those details that nobody else could have known?" Jesus smiled, and for a moment the afternoon light seemed to intensify around him. "I know because I've been with her every day since you were separated. I've been with you too, Michael, even when you thought you were completely alone. I was there in the hospital in Germany, when you cried for your family. I was there during your darkest nights when you wondered if life was worth living. I was there every Tuesday when you fed these pigeons and talked to them like old friends." Michael felt tears beginning to form. "I stopped believing in you for so long. After Sarah left, after I lost Emma, I thought God had abandoned me. I never abandoned you. You couldn't see me through the pain, couldn't hear me through the noise of your suffering, but I was always there, waiting for the moment when your heart would be ready to receive the healing I wanted to give you." Grace's voice called across the park. "Grandpa Mike, old Pete wants to know if you have any more bread." Michael waved to her. "Just a minute, sweetheart." He turned back to Jesus. "She accepts me completely. The scars, the nightmares, the awkwardness of learning to be a grandfather at 65, none of it matters to her. I'm just her Grandpa Mike who tells good stories and knows about pigeons." "Children see with their hearts," Jesus said. "They recognize love even when it comes in damaged packages. Emma's been asking me to go to church with her and Grace this Sunday. I haven't been inside a church in over 15 years. Are you going to go?" Michael hesitated. "I want to, but I'm scared, I guess. Scared that I don't belong there anymore after all these years of anger and doubt." Jesus placed a gentle hand on Michael's shoulder and immediately a warmth spread through his chest, not physical heat but something deeper, something that touched the places in his soul that had been cold for so long. "Churches aren't for perfect people, Michael. They're for broken people who need healing, lost people who need direction, lonely people who need community. You belong there exactly as you are. What if people stare at my face? What if they ask questions about my service that I'm not ready to answer? Then you'll find out that most people carry their own invisible scars, their own stories of loss and recovery. You'll discover that your willingness to show up imperfectly gives others permission to do the same." Michael nodded, feeling a courage building inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. "I want Grace to grow up knowing that faith is possible even after terrible things happen. I want her to see that belief isn't about having all the answers, it's about trusting that love is stronger than loss." "That's exactly what faith is," Jesus agreed. "And you're the perfect person to teach her that lesson because you've lived it." Grace had apparently finished her pigeon conversation, and was now approaching them with the confident stride of a child who expects to be included in adult conversations. "Grandpa Mike, who's your friend?" she asked, looking up at Jesus with curious blue eyes. Michael looked at Jesus, unsure how to explain this relationship to a 4-year-old. Jesus knelt down to Grace's eye level, bringing himself to her height. "Hello, Grace. My name is Jesus. Your grandfather and I are old friends." Grace studied his face with the serious consideration she gave to all new people. "Are you the Jesus from Mommy's bedtime stories?" The one who loves children and does miracles. I am cool. Grace's acceptance was immediate and uncomplicated. Do you want to help us feed the pigeons? Old Pete is really nice, but Rosie is kind of bossy. Jesus laughed, a sound like water flowing over smooth stones, natural and joyful. I would love to help feed the pigeons. The three of them returned to the bench, where Jesus sat between Michael and Grace, accepting pieces of bread, and listening intently as Grace explained the personality and preferences of each bird. Michael watched in amazement as Jesus treated his granddaughter's pigeon introductions with the same serious attention he might give to matters of eternal significance. Grace said after old Pete had finished his afternoon snack, "Grandpa Mike has nightmares sometimes. Mommy says it's because he got hurt in the war and his brain is still healing. Can you fix nightmares?" Michael's face flushed with embarrassment. "Grace honey, you don't need to." Jesus held up a gentle hand. "It's okay Michael." He turned to Grace. "Your grandfather is very brave, Grace. He has nightmares because he saw and experienced terrible things while protecting other people. His brain is trying to process those experiences, like your body processes a cut by forming a scab. So nightmares are like brain scabs. That's a very good way to think about it. And just like physical scabs, they heal better when they're surrounded by love and patience and understanding." Grace nodded sagely. "Mommy and I give Grandpa Mike lots of love. We read him stories when he has bad dreams, and I show him my stuffed animals because they make me feel safe." Jesus smiled at Michael over Grace's head. "You're blessed to have such a wise granddaughter." "I am," Michael agreed. "More blessed than I ever deserve to be." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," Jesus said softly. "Love isn't earned, Michael. It's given freely, received gratefully, and shared generously." As the afternoon progressed, Jesus shared stories with Grace about other children he'd known throughout history. Stories that sounded like fairy tales to her young ears but carried deeper truths that Michael recognized. The little boy who shared his lunch and fed thousands. The daughter who was brought back to life by her father's faith. The children who were blessed simply for being children.
Jesus, Grace said during a pause in the storytelling, "Are you going to come to church with us on Sunday? Mommy says it's important to have friends at church." Jesus glanced at Michael. "What do you think, Michael? Should I come to church with you?" Michael felt a moment of panic. "Would you? I mean, could you? Would people see you?" "Some would, some wouldn't. But yes, I'll be there. I'm always there when my children gather to worship, whether they recognize me or not." "Will I recognize you?" Jesus' smile was gentle and mysterious. "You'll recognize me every time you see Grace's face light up during the children's sermon. You'll recognize me every time Emma takes your hand during prayer. You'll recognize me every time someone in that congregation shows kindness to a stranger, forgiveness to someone who's hurt them, or hope in the face of despair." Grace had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention she usually reserved for fairy tales. "So you're like an invisible friend who becomes visible when people are being nice?" "Something like that," Jesus agreed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the park in shades of gold and amber, Jesus stood from the bench. "I should go now. You have dinner plans with your family." He was right. Emma was cooking pot roast in Michael's tiny kitchen, attempting to recreate a recipe she remembered from her childhood with David, while simultaneously helping Grace with a coloring project and studying for her nursing certification exam. It was beautiful chaos, the kind Michael had never experienced but had always secretly longed for. "Will I see you again?" Michael asked, standing as well. "You'll see me every day if you know how to look," Jesus replied. In Grace's laughter, in Emma's compassion for her patients, in your own willingness to trust that your story isn't over, it's just beginning a new chapter. Jesus knelt down for a final goodbye to Grace. "Keep taking good care of your grandfather, Grace. And remember what I told you about being brave when things seem scary. That brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared." Grace recited perfectly. "Exactly. Your grandfather taught me that lesson a long time ago in a place called Fallujah." Grace hugged Jesus with the same unself-conscious affection she showed everyone she liked. "Bye, Jesus. Thank you for being Grandpa Mike's friend." As Jesus walked away across the park, Michael called after him, "Thank you, for everything, for giving me back my family." Jesus turned back one final time. Thank you, Michael, for showing me that love endures all things, believes all things, hopes all things. Your 23 years of faithful love for a daughter you couldn't see taught me something about the heart of the Father." And then he was gone, not in a dramatic disappearance, but in the natural way that people leave when a conversation is complete. But his presence lingered, like the warmth of sunshine that remains on your skin even after clouds pass over. Michael and Grace packed up their pigeon feeding supplies and began the walk home. Grace chattered happily about their afternoon visitors, both feathered and divine, while Michael processed the profound encounter he'd just experienced. "Grandpa Mike," Grace said as they approached his apartment building, "I'm glad Jesus is your friend. He seems really nice. He is, sweetheart. He's the best friend anyone could ask for. Are you still sad about the nightmares and the always on your face?" Michael considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I'm still sad about those things, Grace, but I'm not sad about who I am anymore. The always and the nightmares are part of my story, but they're not the whole story. The whole story includes you and Mommy and old Pete, and Jesus and all the love that I thought I'd lost forever." Grace nodded with the wisdom of childhood. "That's a good story, Grandpa Mike. Stories with love are always the best ones." As they climbed the stairs to his apartment, Michael could hear Emma on the phone with someone, probably her supervisor at the hospital, arranging her schedule around Grace's pre-K pickup times. The sound of her voice, confident and caring, discussing treatment plans and patient care, filled him with pride. His daughter had become exactly the kind of person he dreamed she would, compassionate, strong, dedicated to healing others. Inside the apartment, the table was set for three. Grace's latest artwork was displayed prominently on the refrigerator, alongside photos from their park reunions, and a grocery list written in Emma's neat handwriting. The space that had been sterile and lonely for so many years now thrummed with the energy of family life. During dinner, Grace regaled Emma with detailed accounts of their pigeon feeding expedition and their conversation with Jesus. Emma listened with the patient attention of a mother accustomed to her daughter's vivid imagination, but Michael could see questions in her eyes. After Grace was in bed, Emma brought 2 cups of coffee to the small living room where Michael was reading one of her nursing journals. "Dad," she said carefully, "Grace mentioned that your friend Jesus joined you at the park today." Michael looked up from the article about PTSD treatment protocols. "Yes, he did." Emma studied his face. "The same Jesus who you met 3 weeks ago, the one who told you about me. The same one. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no judgment behind it. Are you okay? I mean medically, psychologically. The doctors at the VA, have they mentioned anything about hallucinations or episodes related to your PTSD?" Michael set down the journal and looked directly at his daughter. It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself multiple times over the past 3 weeks. "Emma, I know how it sounds. I know that claiming to have conversations with Jesus makes me sound delusional or psychotic. But I also know that everything he told me about you was true. Things that no one else could have known. There could be explanations for that. Private investigators, internet searches, public records. He knew about Mr. Patches before anyone mentioned him. He knew about the song I used to sing to you. He knew about David's death and your nursing career and Grace's existence before any of that information could have been researched." Emma was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and processing his words. "You really believe it was him, Jesus, the actual Son of God?" "I believe it was someone who loved us enough to orchestrate a miracle. Someone who saw a broken family and decided to put it back together. Whether you call that Jesus or divine intervention or answered prayer, I'm not sure the name matters as much as the result." Emma reached over and took his hand. "The result is that I have my father back and Grace has a grandfather who adores her. Whatever or whoever made that possible, I'm grateful. Even if your old man is talking to people who may or may not be supernatural beings." Emma smiled. "Dad, I'm a nurse. I see things in hospitals that can't always be explained by medical science. Patients who recover against all odds, families who find peace in impossible circumstances, moments of grace that happen when people need them most. I've learned not to discount experiences just because they don't fit into neat rational categories." That night, Michael lay in his bed, no longer a lonely single bed, but part of a household where people said goodnight to each other, and checked to make sure doors were locked and knew that someone would be there in the morning.
Through the thin walls he could hear Emma reading Grace a bedtime story, in the voice she'd inherited from Sarah, punctuated by Grace's questions and comments. For the first time in 23 years Michael Thompson fell asleep without dreading the dreams that might come. Not because the PTSD was cured, he knew he'd likely struggle with those demons for the rest of his life, but because he was no longer facing them alone. Sunday morning arrived bright and crisp. Michael dressed carefully in his navy button-down and khaki pants, the outfit Tyler had helped him select weeks ago for his reunion with Emma. Grace wore a blue dress with white flowers that Emma had bought specially for church, and Emma herself looked beautiful in a simple green dress that brought out her eyes. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Emma asked as they walked up the steps of Grace Community Church. Terrified, Michael admitted. "But Grace taught me that being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Inside the church they were greeted by a congregation that was surprisingly diverse: young families, elderly couples, single adults, children running between the pews with the energy of Sunday morning. No one stared at Michael's scars. Several people introduced themselves, thanked him for his service, and welcomed the family warmly. During the service, Grace sat between Michael and Emma, alternately listening attentively to the music and whispering questions about the stained glass windows. When the pastor began his sermon about the parable of the lost sheep, the story of a shepherd who leaves 99 sheep to search for the one that's missing, Michael felt a familiar presence. He looked around the sanctuary, and saw him. Jesus sitting in the back row wearing a simple suit instead of his usual casual clothes, but unmistakably the same man who'd approached his park bench 4 weeks ago. Their eyes met across the crowded church, and Jesus smiled and nodded, as if to say, "I told you I'd be here." But Michael realized he'd been feeling Jesus's presence throughout the entire service, in the warmth of the congregation's welcome, in Grace's uninhibited joy during the children's hymn, in Emma's hand finding his during the closing prayer. Jesus hadn't been absent from Michael's life for 23 years. Michael had simply forgotten how to recognize him. As they left the church, Grace tugged on his hand. "Grandpa Mike, did you see your friend Jesus?" He was sitting in the back. Michael looked back toward the church doors, but the figure he'd seen was no longer there. "Yes, sweetheart, I saw him." "Good. I think church is more fun when friends come with you." Walking home through the streets of Denver, his daughter's hand in one of his and his granddaughter's in the other, Michael Thompson understood that his story wasn't about a broken veteran who'd lost everything in war. It was about a man who'd learned that love endures beyond separation, that families can be restored even after decades apart, and that miracles still happen to people who've stopped believing they deserve them. That afternoon, they returned to Veterans Memorial Park for their weekly pigeon feeding. But this time they brought Emma with them, and she laughed as Grace introduced her to each bird by name and personality trait. Old Pete seemed to approve of the expanded family, accepting bread from Emma's hand with dignified gratitude. As the sun set over the park, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The explosion in Fallujah that had scarred his face and ended his marriage had also been the beginning of a story that led to this afternoon, to his daughter's laughter and his granddaughter's hand in his. "Thank you," he whispered to the evening air, knowing that somewhere somehow, Jesus was listening. Grace looked up at him. "What did you say, Grandpa Mike?" "I said thank you." "For what?" Michael looked at his daughter, beautiful and compassionate and stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. He looked at his granddaughter, brave and wise and full of the kind of love that heals old wounds. He looked at the pigeons who'd been his companions during the lonely years and were now witnesses to his joy. "For everything, sweetheart. Thank you for absolutely everything." As they walked home together through the streets of Denver, 3 generations reunited by love and grace, and an encounter with the divine, Michael Thompson finally understood what Jesus had meant when he'd said that some wounds can only be healed by love. His story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The end. Michael Thompson's journey reminds us that our deepest wounds often become the very places where miracles enter our lives. For 23 years he carried the weight of believing he was forgotten, abandoned, unworthy of love. Yet his daughter Emma never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that love could bridge any distance. What strikes me most about this story is how Jesus didn't appear as a powerful supernatural being performing obvious miracles. Instead, he came as a simple stranger on a park bench, speaking truths that only love could know. Sometimes the most profound divine encounters happen in the most ordinary moments, when we're feeding pigeons, sitting alone, thinking no one sees or cares. Michael's scars told a story of sacrifice and survival. Grace saw them not as flaws, but as proof of her grandfather's courage. This 4-year-old child understood something many adults miss: our wounds don't disqualify us from love. They often become the very reasons others need us. The reunion at Riverside Park wasn't just about a father and daughter finding each other again. It was about discovering that love never truly dies, it just waits patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. Emma kept Mr. Patches for 26 years. Michael carved a bracelet he couldn't give. Both held on to hope disguised as memory. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger appeared at exactly the right time with exactly the words you needed to hear? Have you ever witnessed a reunion that seemed impossible but somehow happened anyway? Tell us in the comments, what's the most unexpected way someone has shown you that you weren't forgotten? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.